back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
This is our country.
Hey, and welcome back to the show, The Law Show on CL 650. We're talking about immigration and citizenship law with Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic, two of the partners from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver. And I want to touch on our Canadian passports. Now, when you travel, you just assume it's going to be no problem. We're Canadian. We can go where we like. But there have been changes to the Canadian passport rules or something to affect them, right? Explain what that is.
Yeah, so in December 2016, a new requirement came in that Canadian citizens...
So this is just a few months ago.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been well publicized on behalf of the government. I think they haven't told people that you need this, right?
A major criticism by the Canadian Bar Association, actually, a letter was written on behalf of the Canadian Bar Association criticizing the fact that they brought in two changes around the same time. First, they brought in what's called the electronic travel authorization. So this isn't a visa requirement, but people, our world is divided up into people who need visas to come to Canada and people who don't need visas to come to Canada. So somebody coming from England gets on a plane, arrives in Canada, and they're processed at the border without having to have done anything beforehand. That is the way the world used to work, right?
And there's so many grandparents that come in the summer.
Exactly. And we don't have problems.
And so things have changed for them that they might not be aware of.
Well, things have changed dramatically. First, it became the requirement that they now have to get everybody except Americans now who before didn't need a visa. So, don't think about sort of Chinese, Iranians, Indians, Pakistanis, they all needed visas. So they're used to this requirement. Sure. Exactly. But now people coming from mostly, Japan, Australia, Western Europe, the United States, they were able to get on a plane and just come to Canada. That changed for all those people except for Americans. They now have to apply for what's called an electronic travel authorization. That means they have to go online before they arrive at the airport, pay $7. It's about a 2-minute application, asks some very basic questions. Do they have a criminal record? What's the purpose of their visit? Have they ever been refused entry? And they will then, what will happen is the passport that they have, the number will be encoded in the system. That way, that when they show up, they give it to the booking agent that lets them on the flight. That'll be run through, and they'll be seen that they have what's called an ETA and allowed on the plane. The problem is people who can't get an ETA are people they have to be a foreign national under the Act. So what's not a foreign national? Well, if you're a Canadian citizen, you're not a foreign national. Or if you're a permanent resident, you're not a foreign national. So you can't get an ETA. Prior to this requirement, people were able to get on anyway because they could have traveled with for example, if they're coming from the UK, with their UK passport, and they would be allowed on.
So there's lots of people that have a British or a EU passport because they like that connection.
They like that connection, or it costs money to get a second passport. Why am I going to bother? It's paperwork. I have my UK passport. I travel on it all the time. It's never been an issue. So what we found happening over Christmas time, and a shock to some people who were stuck in airports, etc., is they had traveled abroad. They're Canadian citizens, for example. We had happened in our office. They're Canadian citizens that traveled abroad, let's say on a French or a UK passport, and all of a sudden they're going to get back on the plane, and guess what? They can't get on. They're like,
they're now a foreign national in the eyes of the airline.
They're not a foreign national, because if they were a foreign national, they could get the ETA.
They could go get an ETA,
I see.
That's
the loophole. Yeah.
So the problem is
get an ETA.
They have to show that they're a Canadian citizen, and the only thing they're going to take is a Canadian passport.
And they didn't take it.
And they didn't take it. They don't have one.
So how do they?
So the resolutions for this were really challenging. I mean, emergency passports had to be issued
over the holidays.
The Canadian
Good luck with
High
that.
Commission had to get involved. There were hundreds of calls to Canadian embassies abroad.
And sometimes a control officer would actually allow it to people.
Flights. People missed flights all over the place.
Had to go back home. Had to try and deal with it by either like you said, getting a travel document, getting a new passport, or hopefully getting an exemption to allow. Which they were allowing some exemptions.
They were allowing some exemption, but there was huge disruption to travel. And so the moral of this story is, in this world now, where anything that happens in the United States, any hiccup or any cough in the U.S. by the U.S. administration can cause all of us here to get the flu. Canadians need to be aware that they need to keep their Canadian passports up to date, particularly if they're dual citizens, because there is no other way for them to get. I mean, the airline will be fined if they let you on the plane, and that's why the airlines have become the sort of enforcement system for a lot of this. And
I travel a ton, and I get asked for the passport check regular before they start boarding the flight. So you have to get a little slip saying that your passport has been checked. So they say, when everybody's standing around waiting to get on the plane, bring your passport up. Let's have a look at it.
So, and this is part and parcel of a number of different changes that are coming down. Now, Rudy mentioned permanent residents. The problem is permanent residents whose cards have not been renewed are also not going to be able to get on flights that are bound for Canada unless they have their cards renewed. And that's another significant group because up till now, people from those visa-exempt countries could get on the plane anyway, but no longer can they. That's
of all the things we talk about over the last couple of months, this is the one that affects the most people listening to this show today. So you're a Canadian and you have a dual citizenship and you've been traveling under that foreign flag, a passport. If you try to get back into Canada, you're not going to be
on a plane, right? So it doesn't affect you at the land border if you're driving, and it doesn't affect Americans.
And there's so many people that I know have a British or a European passport, and they travel on that. I've never understood why, but personally,
it's easier. And the country they're going to, they want to have that passport to enter without any issue, right?
And in many countries, you have to have their passport to enter if you're a citizen. For example, Israel insists on dual citizens using their Israeli passport
the US
when they enter.
The U.S. requires you to enter on a U.S. passport. Right?
So if I'm a Canada-U.S. citizen and I travel to the U.S., I can't go with. You need to bring your U.S.
They want your U.S.
citizen.
passport.
Yeah, your U.S. passport. That's a rule in the United States also.
Yeah. So your advice, I guess, is if you are a dual citizen, keep both passports up to date.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly.
What people need to do now is they have to think carefully. If you're a dual citizen, that now requires you to keep both passports up to date, and so do so. Up till now, it was understandable why you'd want a UK passport that was valid for 10 years versus a Canadian one that was valid for 5. But now that our passports are valid for just as long as any of these European Union ones, there is no reason not to renew your Canadian passport. Go get it done. It's very important.
That's great information. Now, what have you been asked to do in that time when somebody's been stuck overseas?
Well, for us, it's mostly liaising with the airline, calling the embassy, trying to help people get emergency passports. It's kind of the same procedure you follow when, and this has happened to friends of mine who've been pickpocketed in places coming off a cruise ship, and now they need to get an emergency document back. It's a lot of the same procedure, believe it or not.
And how hard is that?
I mean, there's been some leniency at the beginning. I think as we get older in this process, it's not going to be that easy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's sort of been a grace period where the immigration control officers have sort of let the airline let that person board.
So if you have a passport sitting in a drawer at home, you could have it couriered.
You could,
and
absolutely.
get it there the next day. That's one issue. But if the passport has expired, how quickly can you get a passport?
Well,
if you're
tough.
overseas.
I mean, the government has really, unfortunately, the government has changes that the government made in the between 2006 and 2010, and that the Martin government did before that, left a lot of the Canadian embassies short-staffed abroad, and as a result of that, you don't have as many visa posts as we used to have. So if you're lucky that there's a mission in the country that you're in. And in some countries we have a lot. Like, for example, at the Canadian consulate in Barcelona, all they deal with is lost passports by people coming off of cruise ships. So, they have enormous expertise in dealing with this. But if you're in an African country where we don't have an embassy or a consulate, you could be in a lot of trouble.
But the Canadian, that being said, the passport office here down at the St. Clair Center is unbelievably efficient and fast, right?
Yeah.
Like you can get it done in 24 hours sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Are there emergency passports that are only good for 30 days?
Typically 6 months, actually, or a year. And that's what they'll issue them to. And
nation for young kids sometimes. So if the child is born, a Canadian citizen's born abroad and they need a passport, they haven't had a chance to sort of check, the birth certificates and all that stuff hasn't been issued. They'll issue a 6-month passport.
And the other challenge going forward, especially if you're somebody who is affected by the U.S. travel ban in some other way, you have even more reason now to keep your documents absolutely in order because you may not be able to be let into the United States.
Now, you mentioned that somebody who's going back to Iran maybe for a funeral or a wedding or something like that. Those are documents you should keep, that you were there for a legitimate family reason, right? That you went for a wedding or,
The stories we're hearing at the U.S. ports of entry by dual citizens entering are that you're being asked a lot of questions if you were in any of the banned countries. And that's not going to change in the foreseeable future. So people should be carefully documenting that they were there for legitimate purposes especially if they intend to visit the United States.
I mean, something to consider while we're on this topic about returning to those countries. If you are, a lot of those countries produced refugees that came to Canada, and the Canadian government is still seeking to revoke refugee status and also permanent residency from people that they consider ceased their status by returning to their country where they fled from. And so these cessation proceedings are still proceeding, which are horrible stories it's producing. So somebody who has been in Canada for years, got refugee status, got permanent residency, goes back for their mother's funeral, and then arrives, and then they're asked questions at the border. My advice is, number one, if you're a permanent resident, once they determine that you are a permanent resident, you don't have to answer any more questions, and you should ask if you're being detained and call a lawyer, because maybe the next step is, well, you were back in Iran, you claim that you fled Iran for religious persecution, but you've gone back. I don't think you're in a refugee any longer, and we should ship you and your entire family back to Iran, and then those proceedings start. So
those are called cessation proceedings, as Rudy mentioned.
Now, one of the news clips I saw, a young woman, and she was from one of these countries, Canadian citizen, and she says, I don't want to travel. I don't know how I'm going to be treated. But if you were going to the United States and you're showing your Canadian passport, would they know that you have you're from Iran, for example?
It says right on your passport.
It says right on your passport.
Oh, place of birth.
And there was a move to actually get that removed, because after 9/11, Iranian Canadian people that were born in Iran, in Afghanistan, were finding it very difficult at the border and were being interrogated. And there was a complaint that these are Canadian citizens; they have Canadian passports.
Because that's the way I would look at it. You're traveling under the flag of Canada. Yeah. Wouldn't they just treat you the same way they would treat me?
They don't.
Well, but folks, what your listeners need to understand is that this is a long way from being over, and people need to be tolerant. They need to be aware that disruption in the United States may become a permanent fixture.
And as you mentioned, a cough there causes the flu here.
So one of the things that is being actively talked about in Washington as an executive order is biometric requirements on all citizens of all foreign countries. Well, up till now, that's sort of been the evolution of U.S. immigration procedures.
And what does that mean, biometric?
Well, what that means is if you're a visa holder or if you're from a visa-exempt country, you need to pay a $6 fee, put your thumbprint into a thumb reader, which is at almost all U.S. ports of entry, and have a card created saying how much status you have in the United States. Well, guess the one country that's exempt from that rule? Canada. Much like we exempt the Americans from biometrics. There's active talk in the United States about raising the biometric wall to cover every country with no exception.
But as a Nexus holder, when I travel to the United States, I have to put my fingers on my fingerprints get read. Every time.
Or your eye scan. That's true.
Yes.
But
because you've gone through an extra security screening because you travel a lot. What they're talking about is making
that mandatory for everybody.
I mean, it's not unheard of in Canada. When people from certain countries, a lot of them on the banned list of 7, actually, you have to get biometric screening done. It almost becomes sometimes an impossibility for people that are trying to get visas to come to Canada because there is no facility in those countries to actually get the biometric screening done.
So, for example, Iran is an excellent example. Canada has no facility in Iran. Right now, we don't even have a diplomatic mission in Iran that allows for a place for a person to go and get this biometric screening done. So people have to go to either Baku in Azerbaijan or typically Ankara or Istanbul in Turkey in order to complete their immigration procedure, their visa requirements, because they have to physically go and provide fingerprints to get a visa.
All right, we're going to take a break. We're going to continue our conversation about immigration and citizenship with Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic from MKS Law next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.